Welcome to Libeth. We are reading Japanese fairy tales by Yei Theodora Ozaki. We have come through the social world that produced these stories, the structural logic that holds them together, and the figures, human and non-human, who carry their weight. What we have not yet done is ask the question that all of that preparation was building toward. What are these stories actually about, underneath the fishermen and the cranes and the undersea palaces? Because a fairy tale always has two registers. There is the story, what happens, to whom, in what sequence. And there is the argument, what the story is claiming about the nature of reality, about the structure of obligation, about what the universe is like at its foundation. The argument is always there. In Ozaki's collection, it is sometimes very close to the surface, and sometimes buried deep, and learning to read the distance between the two is what this video is about. On its surface, this is a collection of stories about fishermen and dragons, about cranes that weave in the night, about a boy the size of a finger who defeats demons with a needle, about an old man who makes dead cherry trees bloom by scattering ash in the wind. These are the events. And for a certain kind of reading, the kind that wants folklore to be charming, that wants to encounter old stories as a form of cultural tourism, the events are enough. They are beautiful events. They carry the residue of a very old imagination. They have a quality of rightness, a sense that the images are drawing on something fundamental in the way that certain dreams do. But the question that makes the deeper reading possible is not what happens, but why these events and not others? Why this specific constellation of images, relationships, and outcomes in this specific culture, recurring across 1,000 years of telling? Because when something recurs that consistently, it is not decoration. It is structure. It is the culture thinking about itself. The religious substructure of these tales is not a single religion. It is three, layered so completely that in most stories it is impossible to say which layer you are in at any given moment. Shinto is the oldest stratum, animist, pre-doctrinal, organized around the proposition that the natural world is not inert matter but inhabited by spirit, that the kami who dwell in rivers, trees, mountains, and animals are not metaphors for natural forces but actual presences with their own intentions, their own preferences, their own relationships to the human world. Buddhism entered Japan in the 6th century and gradually permeated the entire culture, not replacing Shinto, but layering itself over it and through it, contributing the vocabulary of karma and impermanence and the cycling of souls through successive lives, contributing the idea that suffering is not meaningless, but instructive, that the events of your life are the working out of an account that was opened long before your current existence began. What is extraordinary about the Japanese synthesis of these three systems is not that it managed to hold them together without contradiction. It didn't. There are contradictions everywhere, but that the contradictions themselves became generative rather than destabilizing. The Shinto world, in which the crane is a sacred being of great age and spiritual power, is not the same world as the Buddhist world, in which all attachments, including attachment to a beloved spouse, are the source of suffering and must be released. And yet a story like The Crane Wife inhabits both worlds simultaneously, and the inhabiting is what makes it richer than either world could make it alone. The Buddhist impermanence, the grief of losing what you love, encoded as the story's emotional register, gives the Shinto sacred power of the crane a context in which it becomes tragic rather than merely awesome. When Ozaki wrote The Crane Wife for her Victorian audience, she leaned heavily on the Buddhist Confucian layer, the grief, the devotion, the sacrifice, and allowed the Shinto layer to function as atmospheric background, the beautiful strangeness of a wife who is also a crane. What she preserved less completely is the specific weight of the crane as a Shinto being. The sense that what the husband is losing is not just a beloved person, but a presence of great spiritual significance. A connection to the sacred world that the story treats as genuinely costly to the universe, not only to the household. The story in its full cultural context is not only a domestic tragedy. It is a cosmological event, the withdrawal of a sacred presence from the human world, triggered by a failure of the kind of reverence that the human-sacred relationship requires. The figurative reading of Urashima Tarot is both the most obvious and the richest in the collection, because the story's surface is so transparent that the deeper argument shows through it without much pressure being required. A fisherman goes to a magical place outside of time. He stays too long. He returns to find that centuries have passed in the world he left, that everyone he knew is dead, that he is a stranger in a future that has no place for him. He opens the box he was given against explicit instruction and ages instantly to death. The obvious reading is that this is a story about the irreversibility of time, about the danger of trying to escape your own historical moment, about the cost of choosing beauty over responsibility. That is all present and all correct. But beneath the obvious reading is a more specific claim about the relationship between the individual life and the social fabric. Urashima does not lose time in the abstract. He loses the specific web of relationships, family, community, the accumulated trust and obligation of a human life embedded in a place and a time. That makes a human life meaningful. The undersea palace is not evil. It is not a trap, exactly. It is a place of genuine beauty and genuine pleasure, from which all that structure is absent. There is no debt there. No obligation. No aging parents. No community watching to see if you behave correctly. There is only delight, suspended in a time that does not move, which is to say a time that does not require anything of you. And the story's argument is that this is precisely what makes it fatal. Not the pleasure, the absence of obligation. The box that Urashima carries back is literally the container for all that time he was not living his actual life. And when he opens it, he receives the consequences of that avoidance all at once. The philosophical questions that these stories raise most insistently and refuse most consistently to answer are concentrated around the relationship between virtue and fate. The stories show, over and over, that virtue is rewarded. The kind fisherman receives the Dragon King's treasure. The filial child is given miraculous intervention. The honest woodcutter's axe is returned, along with 2 additional axes, for his refusal to lie about which was his. And yet the stories also show, with equal consistency, that the universe's accounting is not proportional to the human experience of suffering. Urashima's loss is not proportional to his mistake. The crane wife's departure is not proportional to the husband's transgression. He looked, which seems a small thing, against the annihilation of an entire relationship. The stories refuse to tell you whether fate is just or merely inevitable, and that refusal is not a gap in their argument. It is their deepest claim, that the moral order is real, and that it operates according to a logic that is not the same as human proportionality. Something is always watching. The accounts are always being kept. The settlement comes. Whether you would recognize it as fair is a question the stories decline to answer. What Ozaki's book is, at its deepest level, is a document of a civilization trying to preserve, in the form of stories legible to outsiders, the particular way it had organized its understanding of the relationship between the individual, the community, the natural world, and the sacred. This is happening in 1903, at a moment when Japan is actively dismantling the social structures that had sustained those understandings for centuries, when the IE system is being legally reformed, when the samurai class is already a generation gone, when the spirit world is increasingly in competition with the secular rationalism, arriving with every ship from Europe and America. The stories are being told in English, to Western readers, at precisely the moment when their original social context is dissolving. And what survives the translation? What comes through even Ozaki's Victorian frame, even the sentimentalizing, even the loss of the Shinto subtext, is the structural argument that a world in which virtue is registered, in which the boundary between human and non-human is real, in which the accumulated obligations of a human life matter more than any individual desire, is not a primitive fantasy. It is an answer. It is one civilization's considered response to the questions that every civilization eventually has to answer. In the next video, we open the first thematic layer directly: duty, virtue, justice, and the precise and unforgiving moral economy that runs through the entire collection. What Ozaki's book preserves, underneath everything she changed, is a civilization's considered answer to the questions it could not stop asking. Not the political questions. Those are answered differently in every era, and the answers expire. The permanent ones: what do you owe the world? What is the cost of desire? What happens at the boundary between the human and everything that is not human? These do not expire. And the specific form in which this civilization encoded its answers: stories about cranes that weave in locked rooms, about fishermen who stay too long in beautiful places, about old women at crossroads who are something more than old women, carries those answers into any context in which someone is willing to read past the surface. That's all for today on Libeth. One new book every week. At least we try.